This is part 2 of the long road to reform. Now, before diving into the Reformation, we'll do some review and add some detail to the story of the church. We do this because many assume that reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin were wild aberrations, that they just kind of sprang up out of nowhere. I think many Protestants assume that Roman Catholic Church got progressively more corrupt during the late Middle Ages, and that Luther was a lone voice crying in a spiritual wilderness saying, "Enough." Many Roman Catholics would agree that the late medieval church did get a bit off, but they see what Luther did as a massive overreaction that took him off the rails. So in this series, within the larger church story, I want to make sure that we understand that the Reformation was really the inevitable result of a long attempt at reform that had gone on for a while. To do that, we need to go back over some of the ground that we've already covered. As I'm fairly confident that you're now familiar with, Pope Clement V made his headquarters at the French city of Avignon. For the next 70 years, the popes resided there and bent their policies to the advantage of the French throne. The rest of Europe, of course, wasn't much excited about that, giving this period the title the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. When Clement died in 314, the cardinals found it difficult to agree on a successor. And so they elected a 72-year-old, assuming he wouldn't be around long, but that would afford them a bit more time to reach a consensus on a real pope. But wouldn't you just know it, Pope John the 22nd turned out to be far more than a mere placeholder. He lived for 18 years and surprised everyone with his vigorous rule. Pope John was determined to make the Italians honor his papacy and sent troops to force down recalcitrant nobles. To finance these military excursions, as well as funding the expansion of the papal court at Avignon, John devised a complex tax system. That only added to the resentment against his rule. In the decade that Pope Clement VI reigned, nepotism in the church reached new heights, and the papal palace at Avignon rivaled those of the secular courts of Europe for their pompous luxury. Innocent VI made arrangements to move back to Rome, but died before doing so. The 8 years of Pope Urban V were marked by reform of a sort. Urban was an austere man of great personal discipline. He simplified the life of the court and removed from office anyone who wouldn't abide his reforms. In 1365, he returned to Rome to the acclaim of the people, but his policies weren't pro-Italian enough, and loyalty to him quickly eroded. When his rule was defied by large groups, he ended up moving back to Avignon in France. When Urban V died in 1370, Gregory XI was elected. Gregory's uncle had been Pope Clement VI, who'd made him a cardinal at the age of just 17. Yeah, it's that nepotism thing that I mentioned just a moment ago. This Gregory is the pope that St. Catherine of Siena had urged to return to Rome. We talked about that in an earlier episode. On January 17th of 1377, amid great rejoicing, Gregory entered Rome. The Babylonian captivity of the church was over, and most assumed that things would return to normal. But it was not to be. The Great Papal Schism is just around the corner. The Avignon papacies engaged in numerous intrigues and conducted military forays into various regions of Europe. Those, of course, had to be funded, and so the popes came up with ingenious ways to raise revenue that furthered corruption. When an ecclesiastical position was vacant, its income was sent to Avignon. And so the popes rather preferred that these positions remain unfilled. Churches went without bishops. When the position was filled, it was then auctioned off to the highest bidder in a return to the practice of simony that earlier church leaders had worked so hard to end. Since these ecclesiastical offices were a source of income, some managed to secure several of them. But seeing that they could only be in one place at a time, they served as absentee landlords in their other parishes. Added to this simony and absenteeism, the nepotism that marked the Avignon papacy was so bad that by the end of the fiasco, there was a widespread sense of the need for radical reform of the church. And since it was the papacy itself that needed reform, the voices calling for it increasingly understood that reform would need to come from someone other than the Pope. While I would love to dive into the story of the Great Papal Schism, I really don't think that it would make for great material. We've already given a decent summary of it in previous episodes. Any more would just devolve into a long list of names that becomes a jumble. Let me just say that the intrigues that went on during this time are elaborate and complex. It'd probably make for a great TV miniseries. But we're going to just pass over it now and say that the emergence of 2 and then 3 popes, all claiming to be Peter's rightful heir, is one more obvious evidence that things had gone horribly awry in the leadership of the Western Church. It became clear to everyone that reform was needed, and in fact, many were calling for it. During the Great Schism, the Conciliar movement wanted to reform the structure of the church while leaving its doctrines alone. Others, like John Wycliffe, who we recently looked at, and Jan Hus, who we have yet to look at, concluded that it wasn't just the structure of the church that needed reform, no, it was the doctrine as well. As a backdrop to all of this were the frequent popular movements, especially among the poor, who saw the Mongol threat to the east, the 100 Years' War, and the devastation of the plague as harbingers of the end times and potential judgments of God on a corrupt state and church. The Conciliar movement arose to deal with the Great Papal Schism. Church leaders realized that the history of the church had been dramatically shaped by its councils. They'd kept it on the rails at times that it was being threatened with derailing. It began, you'll remember, all the way back in the 4th century when Constantine called the first all-church council at Nicaea. Other crises had been solved by similar councils over the centuries. And then when popes gained power, the councils became instruments to enforce their will. This was especially true in the famous Fourth Lateran Council, which adopted a long list of policies of Pope Innocent III. But as papal authority diminished during the Papal Schism, many hoped that a new council would convene and undo the wrongs that had settled in as the status quo in both church and state. As the theory grew, advocates said that such a council held more authority than the Pope because it would represent the whole church and not the partisan interests of just one pope or one set of cardinals or one throne. Therefore, the council could select a new pope that all should agree on. Now, that may seem like an eminently reasonable thing to us in the 21st century, but the issue was tied in a sticking point that its advocates had a hard time resolving, and it was this: who had the authority to call such a council? Remember that the first council had been called by Constantine, an emperor. Subsequent councils were convened by a notable church leader who convinced other church leaders that a council was needed. And eventually, councils were then convened by the popes. And the findings of a council had to be officially endorsed by the pope, or they were considered invalid. Well, this problem was solved in 1409 when cardinals on both sides of the Papal Schism agreed to a great council in Pisa. And they all lived happily ever after. Well, you know enough of history of this period to know that's not how the story goes. On the contrary, each of the rival popes claimed his own council to preempt the one that was going to be held at Pisa. You got to wonder who would consent to such silliness and be one of those rival councils. Wouldn't you get an invitation to one of those and say, "Oh, thanks, I'm so honored, but yeah, I'm going to have to decline. I need to, visit my second cousin in Tuscany." Yeah, that's it. Tuscany calls. It seems that was in fact what some did because both papal councils failed. So the rival popes retreated to strongholds to await the outcome of the Pisan Council. It had the support of both colleges of cardinals and most of the courts of Europe. Rather than saying that one of the two papal claimants was right, the council declared both unworthy and deposed both of them. The council then renewed opposition to simony, several other ecclesiastical ills, and elected Alexander V as a new pope. Convinced that they'd ended the schism, the council adjourned. So you ready for some fun? Here we go. All of this illustrates just how badly the church needed reformation. Though the Pisan Council deposed the rival popes and installed Alexander, those previous popes refused to step down. And they had enough support to retain their positions, in title at least. So now there were 3 popes. Then, months after being elected, Alexander died, and the cardinals appointed John the 23rd. The ensuing turmoil saw John flee to the German Emperor Sigismund, who was himself in a tussle with 2 rival claimants to his throne, each of which supported different popes. Sigismund called another council to put an end to the now three-way schism. John assumed that this new council would endorse his papacy and agreed with Sigismund to call the council in 1414 at the city of Constance. The council realized that John, he was not the reformer that they needed and deposed him. He fled but was captured and returned to Constance, where he agreed to resign. Worried that he'd flee again and set up somewhere else, he was consigned to prison for the rest of his life. Then the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, resigned, as he'd promised, if his rivals did likewise. The Constance Council passed some rules for reform and began the process of picking a new pope, which resulted in the selection of Martin V. Benedict XIII, last of the Avignon popes, took refuge on the coast of Spain, where he continued his claim as a pope, but by now no one was listening to him. When he died in 1423, no successor was elected. Now, those who gathered at Constance hoped to rid the church of heresy and corruption, and so they condemned Jan Hus, someone they really ought to have embraced as a fellow reformer. They then fumbled when it came to ridding the church of simony and absenteeism, simply because so many in the church's hierarchy had attained their positions that way. It issued some decrees and made provisions for future councils that would meet regionally to address local issues. Now, the next council, called by Martin V, was agreed at Constance. They gathered then at Pavia in 1423, but then moved to Siena due to the plague. Attendance was thin. Not much was done at Pavia. As 1430 and the next council drew near, Pope Martin was inclined to skip it. Advisors informed him the urge for conciliarism was still strong, and if he failed to convene it, it might provoke a new crisis. And so the council met in Basel, during which Martin died. The council picked Eugene IV as his successor, and as soon as he was elected, Eugene adjourned the council. But they refused to quit and considered deposing him. Under threat by Emperor Sigismund, Eugene withdrew the decree of adjournment. Now, up to this point, the Basel Council had gone virtually unnoticed by Europe, but now all eyes were on it. A council seemed to have gained power over a pope. Some said that the council ought to stay convened and rule the church directly. It was then that an urgent request for help came from Constantinople, which was being severely threatened by the Turks. Both the Byzantine emperor and the patriarch there in Byzantine said that they were willing to rejoin the Western Church and take part in the council if it would move to a city closer to Constantinople. Well, Eugene saw this as a way to regain some of his papal mojo and moved the council to Ferrara in northeast Italy. Most of the council refused to relocate, but some, in the hopes of ending the long rift between the East and the West, went to Ferrara. And so it was that the consular movement, which had come into being as a response to the schism, was itself schismed. Yeah, no, it's not a word. There were now two councils, but one pope. The Council of Ferrara later moved to Florence, where it gained recognition for seeing the Eastern Church accept papal authority. The Council of Basel, meanwhile, became more radical in its pronouncements, causing increasing numbers of its members to leave and head off to Ferrara. Basel deposed Pope Eugene and named Felix V as the new pope. So, are you keeping track? There are now two councils and two popes. The consular movement, conceived as a way to end the schism, had resurrected it. But the truth is, the council in Basel had dwindled down to just a small number that people paid little attention to. They moved to Lausanne and eventually disbanded when they realized they had become irrelevant. Felix V gave up his claim to the papacy. Well, it seemed for a while that consularism would be a standing feature of church life. In the end, the popes won. Any future councils would be at their discretion.